All right, we're gonna do a super deep dive on walleye jigs. So if you like chasing walleyes, listen up. Obviously, for most of you, the jig is gonna be the #1 category of bait in your arsenal when you're chasing walleyes. Doesn't matter if it's spring, summer, or fall. So we're gonna go super deep on all the attributes of a jig that I'm looking for. It's not just the weight, it's not just the color. We're gonna talk about that, but we're also gonna talk about hook size, which is something that's really important to me. Hook keeper, that's another thing that's very important to me. The shape of the jig head also. There's a bunch of different factors. We're gonna go deep on it, so by the end of this video, you're gonna be an expert at walleye jigs. So buckle up, let's jump right in. All right, so first things first, we have to talk about size because that is probably the most important factor when you're talking about jigs. So I will use anywhere from a 1/16 ounce jig for walleyes all the way up to like a 1/2 ounce. Sometimes I'll even go as heavy as 3/4 depending on what I'm using the jigs for. That's the thing about jigs, is there's so many different uses for them. But I'm gonna start from the bottom really quick and work my way up and just talk about some of my utilities for some of these jigs. So if I'm talking about a 1/16 ounce jig, what I'm gonna use that for is usually gonna be with live bait. Live bait doesn't create a lot of resistance in the water column, so a 1/16 ounce jig actually can fall somewhat quickly with live bait on it, depending on how deep you're fishing. So when I'm fishing really shallow, 5 feet of water, 6 feet of water, that's where I'm gonna bust out this 1/16 ounce jig. But in addition to that, another time I will use it, and I have used it in the past. We had a really sunny day with clouds coming in and out, so I don't know if that's gonna get kind of dark, but a time where I have used it in the past is also when I'm fishing for suspended fish with forward-facing sonar. So on days where it's really calm, kind of like today, calm sunny day, you can cast a small 1/16 ounce jig with live bait out, probably 40, 50, 60 feet, and slowly work that bait over fish. So 1/16 ounce option is viable for that as well. But moving on from the 1/16 is the next size up, and this is an 1/8 ounce jig. So 1/8 ounce is gonna be my bread and butter for just about everything unless I'm fishing in really deep water. So for me, I can fish the 1/8 ounce up in 3, 4, 5 feet of water. I could put a small plastic on this as well. If I'm using bigger plastics, I'm usually going to use a bigger jig, but like a small minnow style plastic is great on here as well. But put a minnow on here, put a leech on here, put a night crawler on here, and I can use this 1/8 ounce in most situations. If you're comfortable waiting, if you're using electronics, where the fish are set up, you can fish this bait in as deep as 20 feet of water, just slowly letting that bait go down to the bottom. It's going to be a really natural presentation. One thing I would like to add with these weights is just the fact that when you're using lighter weights, you're just going to have a more natural look, a more natural presentation. So generally you want to go as light as you possibly can. For the most part, I'd say that's not 100% rule, but it's a strong suggestion. So 1/8 ounce is what I'm going to be using in most cases. And then when it gets a little bit too deep for the 1/8 ounce, if I'm trying to fish more efficiently, I will upsize to a 1/4. So a 1/4 is also where I start to use more plastics on these jigs as well, but you can still use live bait on a 1/4. We'll talk about hooks a little bit later, but long shank or short shank, there's gonna be different hook styles that are gonna be better for different types of live bait. But live bait or plastics, this is when I'll start to throw smaller paddle tails and stuff on here if I'm gonna be fishing in shallower water. So I would say once I get out to like 15, 16 foot or deeper, and it's important for me to stay on the bottom, that's when the 1/4 is starting to bust out for me. And then from there, if I really need to be fishing fast and efficiently, a 3/8 ounce is a good option because you can put plastic on it, you can put live bait on it, and if those fish are moving around quickly, or if you're trying to cover water or get a faster presentation to get reaction strikes, the 3/8 can be really deadly in those situations. So I will fish a 1/16 ounce jig or an 1/8 ounce jig. I'll put a crawler on that a lot of times, but if I'm going to somewhere like Lake of the Woods, you know, I might put a 3/8 ounce jig on because those fish are roaming around so fast. And if I'm trying to put jigs in front of fish, 3/8 ounce is going to just drop a lot faster. It's going to cast a lot better. That's another factor I didn't quite mention when it comes to the weight, is oftentimes, you know, I will sometimes use like a 1/4 ounce jig in situations where I would normally use an 1/8 ounce jig, you know, as far as depth and stuff. But the 1/4 ounce, you know, I might use this when it's windy or something like that, where an 1/8 ounce gets a little bit harder to cast. I'll switch to this 1/4 ounce and cast a lot easier in those really tough situations. So that's a quick rundown on that. And then when I'm upsizing to like a half, like this is a 1/2 ounce jig. It's got spider webs on it because there's spider webs all over the place. 1/2 ounce jig. What I'm doing with the 1/2 ounce jig for the most part, you actually could fish live bait on this, and I do know some guys who do that. Some of the guys who fish some of the professional, you know, walleye tournament trails and whatnot. But for the most part, I'm putting plastics on these bigger, heavier jigs. So 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce. That's when I'm starting to bust out some of the paddle tails, which I do have a couple paddle tails laying around. So basically swim baits with the kicker on the back. You know, that's when I will start to use these bigger, heavier heads. Like when we went to Rainy Lake last summer, it was a ton of these. So this is the Smeltonator with a bigger hook on it and a 1/2 ounce head. And this was just money with a big paddle tail for walleyes out in Rainy. So it just depends on where you're fishing, depends on what you're putting on these jigs. That's a big part of the puzzle when you're figuring out what weight. So live bait, usually lighter, and then plastics, I'm usually using heavier heads. And it just depends on how fast you want to fish too. With plastics, oftentimes upsizing quite a bit can be really effective because you're trying to fish that bait faster and get a reaction strike, versus live bait, you're trying to tempt those fish into biting. So that's a quick rundown on the weights, anywhere from 1/16 up to like 3/4 ounce. So now we're gonna move on to the next important item when it comes to jigs. All right, now let's change gears and talk about the hooks that you have on the jig. So obviously the weight is super important, but the hook is also super important as well. First things first, let's cover down on long shank versus short shank. So for me, if you're talking about plastics, I would say 90% of the time I'm using a long shank hook to put plastics on. So I'm almost always threading plastics onto the hook, and having that nice straight long shank is just gonna be ideal for most plastics. The only time when I'll use the shorter shank for plastics is when it's a really small plastic and there's just not a lot of meat to thread that plastic onto. So shorter shanks, you know, for that 5 or 8% of really small plastics you run into, and then longer shank for everything else. And then beyond that, if you're talking about live bait, night crawlers. I like to use long shank hooks for night crawlers. So some people will use short shank, but I like having that hook a little bit further back. I'll thread a night crawler onto the hook the same way I would thread a plastic on there. So long shank for night crawlers. When I'm using leeches, you can get away with either of them because I'm just nose hooking those leeches right behind the suction cup. So you can get away with both, but I'm usually, if I have a preference, I like to use the short shank jigs for leeches. And then when you're talking about minnows, a lot of people like to use minnows on jigs. A lot of times I'm using a short shank jig, and then I'm just nose hooking that minnow and just letting it kick, having as much, you know, freedom of movement, and just having that hook through the nose. But another thing that I will do is I will sometimes use a long shank hook, and then what I'll do is I'll actually like double hook that minnow on there. And there's a lot of videos on there. This isn't necessarily going to be the time when I'm going to be demonstrating, but double hooking a minnow onto a longer shank hook can be good as well. Or sometimes you can almost thread those minnows on there kind of like you would a plastic, but that generally doesn't work as good as, you know, double hooking or nose hooking. So that is longer shank versus shorter shank. And now we're actually gonna get into hook size itself, because hook size is another big part of the equation as well. And for me, I'm usually using anywhere from a 1/0 size hook all the way up to even a 5/0 sometimes. So let's get into the different sizes. Okay, so we're gonna start at the small end, which is 1/0, and then we're gonna work our way up through the different sizes. So this one right here is actually a juicy little live bait fishing setup. So this is an 1/8 ounce jig, and I have a 1/0 hook on it. So this one right here, especially in this darker camel color, we'll talk about color later, is just like a really, really juicy hook to put a night crawler on. So for me, when I'm using night crawlers, I traditionally have used anywhere from a 1/0 to a 2/0. So the 1/0, obviously very, very finesse, small, just a good hook size if you want something that's really finesse. And then the 2/0 is just a little bit bigger than that. But for me, when I'm using the 1/0 is pretty much never gonna put plastics on a 1/0 hook, but I'll put night crawlers on there, you know, I'll put leeches on there. Sometimes, you know, if I want a jig to put underneath a bobber, a 1/0, maybe even downsizing to a number 1 size hook on a jig below a bobber. But yeah, that's when I'm gonna be using the 1/0 for the most part. When I do upsize to the 2/0, for me, when this comes into play is still mostly live bait. So, you know, leeches, night crawlers, some minnow situations as well. But I'm also just starting to sneak into some of the plastics. So with the plastics I'm talking about, with a 2/0 size hook, it's mostly gonna be like really, really thin, small plastics, smaller plastics that aren't very big. They're a lot thinner. So that's mostly gonna be when I'm using 2/0 size hooks. And then when I upsize to 3, that's when you're starting to get into a more universal plastic size. So you can use live bait. A lot of time I'll use like a 2/0 or a 3/0 for most of my minnow profiles. Minnow profiles as in like live minnows, shiners, stuff like that. So that's kind of the 2 or 3/0 size. But 3/0 is like a really good size for using like your traditional like fluke plastic, you know, eye candy minnow, you know, any of those just like minnow shaped plastics, 4 inches or so, you know, which is kind of a good universal size. That's when the 3/0 comes out for me. You could use a, you know, 5-inch plastic on there as well. And then when I get to 4/0, that for me is when I'm busting out bigger plastics. And what bigger plastics mean is like, you know, a swim bait. Usually a swim bait, because they're thicker, they're bulkier, and you need a bigger hook, a little bit more hook gap. When I went up to Rainy Lake with my buddies and I was fishing, you know, bigger swim baits for walleyes, I was using a 4/0 hook for the most part. And then if you wanted to as well, you could upsize to a 5/0 hook in those same scenarios. So 4 or 5/0 hooks is when you're, you know, talking about bigger, bulkier plastics like swim baits. 3/0 hook is when you're talking about, you know, kind of like your intermediate size plastics, smaller plastics, and then also like minnows and some live bait. 2/0 is when you're talking about super, super small finesse plastics and also, you know, crawlers and leeches. And then the 1/0 is just that sneaky little assassin sized hook for, you know, night crawlers and leeches and stuff like that. So another thing that I'm looking for as it pertains to hooks when I'm looking at jigs is just the overall quality of the hook. So if you're talking about, you know, super low end, cheap Chinese hooks that bend out super easy or are brittle and snap or don't have sharp points, you know, for me that's a huge no-no. Walleyes are so hard to catch and get to bite. You want to have a good hook. You don't want to lose a fish that you actually got to bite. A lot of the lakes around here, it can be tough to get bites. So for me, I like to go with stuff that's, you know, at a bare minimum very good. So a lot of times that comes down to, well, first of all, if you don't know about, you know, what brands are good and whatnot, a lot of it is just feeling the hook. So if you take the the tip of the hook here and put it into your fingernail, you can kind of feel like how sharp it is based on, you know, how much it catches on your fingernail. So just use a bunch of different hooks in your tackle box and you'll start to understand what I'm talking about. But another thing is just taking that hook and just feeling how tough it is. Does it bend easy? Does it break when you put a little bit of pressure on it? So for me, like a lot of the hooks that I'm using on these jigs, you know, I do a lot of work with Northland, and they use kind of like the higher end mustad hooks as kind of just like their standard hook on a lot of these jigs. So these are really good high quality hooks, I would say, for the price. And then kind of on some of their premium lineup, they're using Gamakatsu. And for me, like when I hear Gamakatsu, I just know that that's an extremely high-end hook. They're always super sharp. And then even their lighter wire hooks are super, super strong. Like I know that I could catch, you know, saltwater fish on these hooks. But yeah, like a walleye on a swim bait, I don't mind having a lighter wire hook if I know it's a Gamakatsu hook, for example. But some of the other premium brands, I'd say, you know, like I play around with a lot of different hooks, whether it's for open water walleye fishing, ice fishing, you know, kind of jig hooks, or like trebles, you know, for crankbaits or for spoons in the winter. And for me, like a few of the things that I'm looking for is like higher end mustads are always really solid all around and good for the price. And then Gamakatsu, ultra premium. And then other brands like Owner makes a really good hook as well. The Redline series and VMC. But yeah, that's kind of a quick rundown on some of the brands and some of the things that I'm kind of looking for just overall with the quality of the hook. You know, a lot of what makes a jig good or not good is having a good hook. So that's something that I'm always super anal about. All right, now something that I'm not nearly as anal about is actually going to be color. So a lot of people get pretty obsessed with color, but for me, not as big of a deal. I'll actually go all over the board on color, and I don't even know, you know, if I'm going to be all inclusive in this video. I don't know that I can give any super hard recommendations on color, just because it's so dependent on the body of water that you're fishing. But I guess I will share just a few of my thoughts, sort of how I like to think about it. So a lot of it's gonna kind of break down into dirtier water versus clear water. So dirtier water, I'm gonna be using colors that, you know, sometimes I'm using natural colors, but that'll be a time when I might go a little bit heavier on some of the brighter, you know, more aggressive colors. But for the most part, I do think that natural colors can work everywhere. You know, you get into clear water, and a lot of times natural is going to be king for the most part. And that's not to say that on your favorite body of water, you're not going to be able to catch them on, you know, pink and chartreuse, you know, just because it's a clear body of water. But for the most part, I'm going more natural on those clear bodies of water. But a few colors that I like, first and foremost, black is going to be just a good universal color. I like black in clear water because it's very, very natural, especially if you're using live bait. It pairs well with live bait. It's just kind of a natural color, you know, where it'll kind of blend in with a night crawler, a leech, or a minnow. But then also in dirty water, honestly, black is a great color in dirty water too, because it actually sticks out in dirty water a lot more than you'd think. It's pretty easy for the fish to see. Another one is going to be white. So white is one thing that's interesting about white. So some people might think of white and say, oh, you know, that'd be a great color to pair with a minnow, because minnows are also white. But I've had times in kind of like that in between water clarity, where, you know, the water is somewhat clear, but maybe there's like a little bit of a stain to it. White can be really critical, even on something like a night crawler. Like I've had days where I've been fishing with buddies and we're casting at targets on forward facing sonar. It's just, honestly, like that scenario is just perfect for testing like one lure versus the other, because you take turns and you get to see how that fish reacts. And you know, he was using something darker like green pumpkin or black, and I had something that was white, or it was like half white, and it was almost like, even with a perfect cast, like that fish couldn't quite see his bait. And then something with a little bit of white just popped a little bit in that clearer water, and the fish saw it a lot better and ate it. And that was kind of a theme that day, where there were like 4 or 5 fish that were just seeing my jig that had a little bit more white on it. They were just seeing it a little bit better. So white can be a tool in those scenarios as well. Also, another color that I will use in pretty much all scenarios is chartreuse. So for whatever reason, it seems like walleyes just love chartreuse. Doesn't matter if it's clear water, doesn't matter if it's dirty water. It's just like an extra little splash of color that it seems like even on the fisheries where you have to be super, super natural, chartreuse is like an exception. So always have chartreuse in your arsenal. If you're going to Mille Lacs, white and blue, super, super good combo on a jig. Like some of our best spring bites have been on this exact color combination. So obviously that's a clear body of water. There's zebra mussels, a bunch of forage in there. You know, sometimes when you're thinking about color, you want to be thinking about forage. What's in the lake? You know, what are the fish feeding on? And obviously, you know, blue and white is going to be, you know, prime minnow situation. But blue and white, something to play with. And then, like, man, another color that I just feel like it works everywhere. Doesn't matter if you're fishing like dirty Lake of the Woods or clear Leech Lake, anything like that. Just gold, especially metallic gold, I feel like is just a winner everywhere. So that's another thing you can think about too, as well, is, you know, painted colors versus metallic colors. So I feel like, you know, a lot of times with metallic colors, you have a little bit more light reflection. Like sometimes when I'm working those fish higher in the water column, having a metallic color is just a totally different look, because there's more light penetration in that top, you know, 10 feet of the water column than there is down at the bottom. So that's something I'm thinking about a little bit more as well when I'm fishing for fish up shallow. But, you know, there's just going to be a lot of places where it's like some fisheries just do really, really well with certain colors. And, you know, eventually the locals will all figure out what those colors are. And, you know, they probably figured them out 20, 30 years ago. But like we went to Green Bay, and it's like everybody's got a black and purple hair jig tied on. Black and purple, like make sure you got black and purple. Not to say that they won't bite on, you know, perch colored or, you know, whatever, any other color. But black and purple, Green Bay, you know, whatever it is. Honestly, white and blue, Mille Lacs. That's something I can say is a pretty hard pattern. So some of these fisheries are going to have their different specific colors that you really should have or need to have. But if you've got, you know, a moderate sized stocked walleye lake in your neck of the woods, and you're trying to figure out the secret color, just cycle through a bunch of stuff until you figure out what the walleyes really like on that body of water. But as a rule of thumb with color, I like to always lean towards natural for the most part, because that's just universally going to be solid for catching fish. And I talked a lot about how I didn't think color was super important, and I'm not super anal about it. And then I just talked for like 5 minutes about it. So anyway, let's get on to the next subject. All right, the next topic is going to be head shape. So head shape is another one where I don't think it's extremely critical. I'm much more concerned about the weight of the jig itself, the hook that's on there, also just what the heck you're even putting on the jig, whether it's live bait or plastic. So the shape of it isn't as important for me. If I'm fishing this bait, if I'm fishing the bait, you know, through the water column, over the tops of the weeds, for the most part, the shape of the jig doesn't matter too much. But one thing that I do consider a little bit is when I'm fishing the bait on the bottom, where something that has some sort of stand-up shape is probably going to have a little bit of an advantage, because there's a significantly better chance that that jig stands up on the bottom when it's on the bottom. So you have, you know, your bait kind of more up in the air. So that being said, if you are using, you know, a plastic that happens to float, like the eye candy plastics float, Z-Man plastics float, a lot of Rapalas plastics float, you can turn like a pill-shaped jig head, you know, or even like kind of more of like that Smeltinator style jig head. You can take that and turn that into a stand-up jig pretty easily as well. You know, most of these jigs have 90-degree line tie. So, you know, a plastic that floats is obviously gonna stand up in the water. Also, I apologize if there's some wind noise here. The wind decided to pick up. We got clouds, we got sun, we got calm, we got wind. But we're gonna fight through it. But that being said, like if I'm using a crawler or a leech or something, that's not naturally gonna float up into the water column. So having some sort of stand-up jig is gonna be an advantage as well. So I am using some of those every now and then. So whether that's like just like a stand-up jig or like some sort of Ned jig. Ned jigs are also really good and kind of shaped to naturally stand that hook straight up in the air. So that's what I'm thinking about when it comes to jig heads. But we're gonna move on to the next topic. All right, the last item we're gonna talk about actually is one of the more important ones for me, and that is the keeper, the bait keeper on the jig. So there's a few different categories of bait keepers, and actually there's a lot of different specialty keepers out there on the market today, especially in the bass world. You'll see all different types, but just really quickly we're gonna run through this. So the most popular and classic keeper is just the wire keeper, where you have an extra piece of wire coming down from the jig head and then it comes up at like a 45-degree angle. And for me, this is gonna be a great keeper for plastics. You know, it's super, just super standard, honestly, and it works good for plastics. It also honestly works fine for minnows as well. So that's where I'm thinking about that style of keeper. The next one is gonna be like a conical keeper. You'll see some jigs like the Smeltinator have a conical keeper where it tucks all the way up to the back end of the jig. Other brands you'll see where they're like the conical keeper is like in the middle of the shank of the hook. So the conical keeper in a lot of cases for me, I would say, is an upgrade over that wire keeper. And the reason why, it's super easy to thread plastics onto a conical keeper like this. Also, it just seems to be significantly better for some forms of live bait, specifically night crawlers, where they thread up and hold on a lot better onto here. Like a wire keeper is gonna shred a night crawler. So I've used a lot of Smeltinators with night crawlers on them, and they work like really solid, I would say, for crawlers. And then the last one is kind of like a specialty style keeper, but like this little double pronged keeper that they have on Northland's tungsten lineup. So they have the normal tungstens and then they have the stand-up tungstens. I actually like the keeper a little bit better even on the stand-up tungstens. And the reason why is this is gonna work super good for plastics. It's gonna work good for, you know, night crawlers, minnows, anything like that. But this is by far my favorite night crawler keeper. And when you're talking about using night crawlers, which is really common in the walleye world, having a good keeper is huge because, you know, you cast that thing out and one or two casts later, the tip of your night crawler is all shredded up, and you know you have to change night crawlers, or you have to deal with pushing it back onto the hook every time you cast. That's no good. The stand-up tungsten has such a cool keeper where it just, for whatever reason, it really keeps the night crawlers on there super good. I can cast big bomb casts 70 feet, you know, putting a lot of kind of momentum and torque onto that jig and that night crawler as it's flying through the air. And basically, like, those worms never kind of slide down the shank or fall off. So it takes a little extra second to get that crawler up above the keeper itself, but once it's on there, you almost have to like peel it off with your fingernails. So I'm using crawlers a lot, kind of spring, summer, and fall, and this is my absolute favorite keeper for using crawlers. So yeah, that can be really, really critical depending on what you're doing. You know, if you're using plastics a lot, the keeper really doesn't matter too much. Some keepers will be slightly better than others, but for the most part, basically all keepers are designed to be effective with plastics. But once you start getting into live bait, you know, they're just not as durable as plastic. So, you know, having a keeper that's going to work good in those scenarios is super big. But the keeper is actually somewhat high on my hierarchy of importance when you're talking about jigs. So if I were to create like a power ranking right now, I would say the weight of the jig is definitely still number one, because it impacts drop speed. It impacts, you know, whether you're fishing deep or shallow, how efficiently you can fish. Changing up the weight of your jig can help you get in front of more fish before they swim away, you know, whether you see them on side imaging or on forward-facing sonar or anything like that. But number two, I would say, is either going to be, it's really close. It's either between the hook or the keeper. And honestly, if I'm talking about night crawlers specifically, like a jig and a night crawler, I would say for sure the keeper is the number two most important. But I would say if you're talking about walleye fishing in general, I would say the hook is probably the second most important factor. So let's say the weight is number one, the hook is number two, the keeper is number three, just generally. And then after that, honestly, the fourth most important is probably going to be color for me, because color can make a big difference, I would say, depending on where you're fishing. Some days you'll just see there'll be one or two colors that really dominate. And then the fifth most important factor on kind of the power ranking is going to be the shape of the jig, honestly. In some cases it's nice to have certain shapes, but for the most part I'd say the other four factors are more important. So that's my full rundown on walleye jigs. I didn't want to necessarily take one or two jigs and say you need to get this specific jig when you're going out walleye fishing. It's the best, so get this one. I wanted to break down all of the different categories and things that I'm looking at when I'm looking to pick up a jig. So I could go to a tackle shop somewhere crazy, like I could go to the Netherlands or something. If they don't have any of the jigs that I'm used to using, I can take the characteristics and the things that I know that I want in a jig, and I can find a jig that's going to work great for me. So hopefully breaking down all these factors will just make it so you're a little bit more knowledgeable on jigs, and the next time you go to the tackle shop, you know the things that I'm looking for, but then you can also take that and transpose that to the type of fishing that you do, and you can kind of edit that, you know, for your favorite body of water and say, these are the things that I'm looking for where I fish for walleyes. So I just wanted to give you the tools instead of saying you have to get, you know, X jig or Y jig. You know what to look for. So anyway, that's the whole video. Just wanted to share that with you guys. Gonna be out on the water the next 3 or 4 days, so I'm pretty excited, and gonna be chasing walleyes. We finally got some good weather, and I'm excited to go out and do some more filming. I've, you know, fished a couple days through that cold snap, and it was fun, you know, good action, nice to get out, but now I'm excited for some nicer days to whip out the cameras and shoot some more video for you guys. So anyway, that's the whole thing. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. You guys are awesome. And I'll drop another video on the screen right now. I'm not sure what that video is, but it's gonna be right here. So you can click on it to watch more good walleye catching content.